Hey Gators, and welcome to Terrorism in Europe Part 2. We're going to go into more detail about the history and the kinds of attacks that we're seeing in Europe, as well as share with you my research. So I want to pay it forward to all the professors that I was able to see their research when I was in class. And I felt like it really humanized them. They weren't just a talking head. It let me see their experiences and their challenges, as well as what research feels like and how it works, and really give a story to the topics that we're dealing with in class. So I always appreciated a good story. I think most people are the same way. So I'll be giving you the story of my research and sharing with you the lessons that I learned in interviewing law enforcement in Europe. So without further ado, we'll jump on in. One thing that's important to know as we begin is historically, European terrorism really was far left, but we've seen that change. So from the 1960s to the 1980s, left-wing terrorists were more prominent. Not to say that we didn't see right-wing or single-issue terrorists out there, they just weren't common. And they would really focus on attacking international symbols in solidarity with defined oppressed groups. So it wasn't necessarily that that target was the oppressor, it was symbolically an oppressor. Or the attack was in solidarity with some other egregious act that occurred. Now, Western European extremists have been a lot more quiet since the 1990s to present day, but some would argue that that's changing. In the 21st century, extremist religious ideologies really inspired followers, using the internet and social media to safely and remotely coordinate attacks from a distance and promulgate messages of direct action by sympathizers. And that's a lot of what Hoffman is talking about in modern times, that you don't have to be in the country, or you can operate cells in the country and not have a full-blown presence. And that's a lot of what we've seen in Belgium. Spillover effects. So essentially, those who engage in political violence internationally will often hope or expect that it will also impact their cause at home. So they're hoping that it will embolden people to take up arms. Which isn't too far of a cry from guerrilla warfare, right? We've seen that before. Essentially, exposure on the global stage was really purported to bring about compensation in the form of recruits, of funding, and supports for perceived injustices. So when we look at the targets of these terrorist actors, they'll fall generally into two categories when we look at European terrorism. The first one is domestic attacks against victims with international profiles or identities. So again, high symbolism there. And then the second one is essentially operations in a foreign country. Okay? So we'll get into detail with both of these in just a moment. When it comes to domestic attacks with victims and international profiles, this is what we're getting at. So the examples include diplomats, business persons, military personnel, tourists, academics, and journalists, especially journalists, again, as symbols of a bigger oppressor. These are considered legitimate targets of equal merit because of the enemy they represent. When we talk about operations in a foreign country, these are the terrorist cells that we're getting at. So essentially, terrorists will travel abroad to strike at an enemy, often under the guise of a tourist. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like David Coleman Headley in The American Terrorist, when he traveled to Copenhagen to try to perpetrate an attack on a newspaper that printed unfavorable images about the Prophet Muhammad. So that's exactly the kind of strategy we see. It's a very common strategy, and we've seen that employed in various countries in Europe. Examples include activating terrorist cells in national cities to hit places like train stations, schools, cafes, nightclubs, and markets, or businesses or newspapers. We've seen that as well. So I'm going to take you to a couple of these places and talk about them in particular. So this is Borough Market in London. This was attacked recently, and this represented how terrorists are starting to move into civilian targets. This is one of the oldest open-air markets in Britain, and you see a bell that's hung there. It was hung by the people. It's very much a community-based market, and we have a lot of symbols in these markets and targets now that are memorial symbols for their attacks. When I talk to the vendors, they say, you know, we're the ones that really suffered the most. Obviously, the casualties suffered a lot, but as far as how it disrupted public life, we were closed for a very long time, and we sell produce and cheese and some perishable goods, and our goods were going bad, and we had to throw them out. And so we were in danger of maybe having to permanently close the market. And the community really rallied and bought our bad produce so that we could stay open and stay operating. You also see in a photo next to the borough market, you see these kind of green boxes that are really kind of barriers so people aren't driving in there, and they're trying to operate the pedestrian traffic as well as the bike traffic and car traffic into the market. But it was a very sad day that day, and they actually have constant police patrol around the market now, and I don't really see that changing anytime soon. But again, it's this type of attack that is really meant to disrupt community solidarity. We also saw changes in emergency checkpoints and devices. So these are much more prominent. If you visit Europe, this is obviously the UK, but if you visit Europe, you're going to see a lot of this as you travel around because people travel largely by train and metro. So the very first picture is on the London Bridge. And that was when the London Bridge was attacked. And now we have these kind of emergency lifeboats and devices all throughout the bridge just in case it gets attacked. Bridges are high targets and they get patrolled regularly. The next photo is a help point in the London Underground, or the Tube as we like to call it. The subway stations strung throughout London and of course throughout the UK. So these were mostly information points, but they've been kind of converted into fire alarms / emergency stations as well. And you see these all over the place. The last photo is a different station that I visited that was also attacked. And they have posters from the British Transport Police that say, "See it, say it, sorted." We saw all kinds of campaigns that tried to encourage people traveling via train to report suspicious activity and to be helpful in the fight against terrorism, because these attacks are very, very real. I traveled to somewhere around the way of 15, maybe 17 different stations that were bombed. And it's a very real threat that the UK experiences. These are some of the British Transport Police officers that I spoke with, and I really appreciated their perspective. Of course, they were very curious about who I was and why I was going to all these stations and why I was taking all these pictures. And then after a while, they, I think, felt very supported, because I told them, I'm here to study you. I'm here to talk to you. And that's one of the strategies that you use when you try to talk with people in an environment doing field research is you help them understand your purpose. You present an authentic and genuine front so that they can know that, you're not poking around like a tourist. I'm actually a researcher. I'm from the United States. And I want to get perspectives and feedback on how the fight against terrorism is going. And then we would start the interview, we would start talking. And once they feel supported, I'm not a threat, they can kind of relax a little bit and talk with you. And these officers were really great to help me understand really what's changed. And they said, unfortunately, while we've kind of amped up our patrols, we've also had shortages in officers. It's very difficult to recruit officers. We've seen changes in our pensions. We've seen changes in years to retirement, and that hasn't been easy to recruit officers. But the fight remains. And it was interesting to see kind of perspectives from younger officers and older officers. One thing they pointed out to me was the trash can. Okay, so this is rubbish, right, where you would throw your trash. Now notice there's a clear liner in the can and it has a rubber band around the top. They said, that's a counterterrorism tactic. And I said, how so? They said, basically, a lot of devices were put in trash cans in metro stations. So what people would do is they'd kind of put it in there to hide it. No one would know about it. The device would go off and catastrophe would ensue. So they said, to prevent this from happening, we changed out these trash cans and put clear liners with rubber bands around the top, or elastic bands of some kind, so that if a heavy device were to be put inside this rubbish can, that it would sink to the bottom, and we would see that there's some kind of thing in there. We'd go investigate and go call bomb squad or whoever they need to deal with it. So this actually helps them find devices, and it creates the transparency they need to do investigations and deal with these devices. So I thought that was actually a pretty smart way to do it. We still fumble with this in the United States because many venues that have high security have very traditional trash cans, and you get arguments about the aesthetic quality. We don't want to see our garbage, and we want to have lots of trash cans around because we want to keep the place clean, or this is a place of free protest, and we need to have places for people to eliminate and places for people to put their trash. But that makes a bomb squad's job very difficult, because now they not only have people to safeguard, they got to go through all these trash cans. One way around it is to rotate the trash cans and do a rotation so that one trash can doesn't stay in the same place twice. But to me, the UK has a much simpler solution. Use clear trash cans with elastic liners that will show you if a heavy object is in there, because the liner will fall through the can. I think that's genius, and I really appreciated that. This next stop was the 7/7 visit for the 7/7 bombings. This was the square where the London double-decker bus was actually hit. I actually took this photo right as a bus was passing by on purpose, so you could start to see the context and where it happened. You can also see there is a marker here that says July 7, 2005. Opposite this place, a bus was bombed, killing, and then it had a list of all the people next to it. People still put flowers on this marker to this day, and you have a whole film that's going to show you all the coordinated attacks that happened on 7/7 and why this was such a big deal in the UK, and I'll let you see that video without stealing its thunder. When we talk about major counterterrorism operations going on in Europe, this is what we're talking about. So we now see coordinated strike teams and SWAT teams that do regular training on trains and buses and the London Underground. So they're also heavily armed, which is a shift in the gun culture and the policing culture of the UK and certainly Europe. And this could be a little unsettling for traveling civilians because they're not used to law enforcement packing such heavy ammunition. But in the name of counterterrorism, it's been proposed and justified, and we'll start to read about how some of those legislative changes have occurred. But these are photos of some of these types of drills that law enforcement would do. This is another photo of our transport police, again, packing very, very heavy arms in some of the largest stations in the UK, like Waterloo, okay? And that station actually was targeted, but the bomb went off early in a station that was a transfer station en route to Waterloo. So when I talked to British Transport Police and interviewed them about the attacks that have occurred in their stations, one thing they mentioned was it was very clear that there were A and B targets. So the A targets are the biggest stations that have tens of thousands of people going through them an hour. Okay, the major hubs that not only have the London Tube, the Underground, but National Rail, right, that take you to places like Liverpool, Birmingham, and Manchester. Okay, so these stations were often the A targets, the primary targets, but again, due to train delays, they would go off at the B stations, the smaller stations, or the transfer stations. So some people were kind of curious as to why those stations were hit. And the answer is they weren't the primary target. The bomb went off on time, but because of train delays, it went off early at a station prior to the primary target. So that's one way that we've been able to think about how terrorists plan their attacks, because remote detonation is a little bit harder to pull off if you're underground and you don't have strong signals to deal with remote detonation. So you have to use timers oftentimes. And that's why we've seen the smaller stations hit rather than the larger stations, which the larger station attacks would have been much more devastating and catastrophic, but not to take away or dismiss the tragedies that happened at the smaller stations. But that's some of what we've seen historically. This top photo is actually Victoria Station in Manchester, where the Ariana Grande concert was attacked. So this is kind of a 360 panoramic view of the corner where the Victoria train station is in Manchester, and also the surrounding square that was also bombed by Manchester Arena. So this is where the people were evacuated to when the bombing occurred. It's interesting, I almost had my camera confiscated because there is still a very high security protocol for what filming is allowed in the station and the surrounding square because these attacks are so recent. They don't want people filming areas to use as reconnaissance for future attacks, and so you have kind of no film zones and stuff like that. So after I was able to talk with British Transport Police and help them understand my purpose, and I agreed to cease and desist my filming, they agreed to let me keep my footage and my photos and not confiscate it. So I was very fortunate that I didn't have to do that. And you have to be very careful when you do this kind of research. And so you can go seek permission from the station manager. You can show them your IRB protocols and your sponsoring university, and they can do a little bit of fact-checking and background checking to make sure of your purpose and so forth. But you have to be careful because sometimes not everybody gets the memo. These are some more British transport officers that I was able to interview for my study, and they also use mounted patrol or horses. Mostly they were using horses that evening because there was a football match, or as we say in America, soccer, and they were worried about hooligans and people roughing it up and fighting outside the match, which can be a very serious event. And this was a match that was going on, a very prominent match between Man U and another team that night. No, I did not get to go to the Manchester United football match. I wish I could have. It was a very high-profile game, and it would have been fun. But when you have high-profile events, they can often be terrorist targets. So it's kind of all hands on deck when it comes to that. Overall, the numbers today are down. We still see attacks, and they are, of course, still very unfortunate. But is the far-right activity actually up? So this is what we've been studying lately. The study of terrorism and responses to terrorism, or START, that I've mentioned before in our methods module, found that there were actually 10,900 terrorist attacks around the world last year. So that's total in the globe, which killed a total of 26,400 people, including perpetrators. That was a drop from 2016, which was in turn another drop from 2015. So right now, the number of terrorist attacks and deaths from terrorism appear to have peaked in 2014, when there were nearly 17,000 attacks around the world and more than 45,000 victims. So what explains this downward trend? Well, terrorism from far-right extremists is also on the rise in Europe, as it is in the United States. So in 2017, Europe saw the highest number of right-wing attacks in over 2 decades. And so this is something that we're still dealing with and we're suspecting will continue. It's still a present threat. While the rate of such attacks appears to have declined in 2018, possibly due to the dismemberment of the Islamic State's self-declared caliphate, or ISIS, in Iraq and Syria, Europe still faces a continuing threat from returning foreign fighters, from online radicalization, and potentially from convicted terrorists whose prison terms are ending and they are being released. So that is also a current debate. What's interesting is in the United States, we tend to give terrorists life sentences and they never get out. In Europe, it's not so much the case. But it also depends on the conviction and the offense. So if it's just plotting and planning, but not carrying out, that could have a much lower sentence than someone that was found in an attack actively carrying it out. But again, constant debate on the global stage about how to punish terrorists and whether they should be released, if they can show that they're not radicalized anymore and they can be productive citizens. Again, we mentioned this earlier, but we have changes in gun ownership culture. So gun ownership is actually rising across Europe, which is a continent that until recently faced far less gun crime and violence than much of the globe. Not long ago, it was really rare to see armed British police. The uptick was spurred in part by insecurity that's been arising from these terrorist attacks, many with firearms, and reflecting government efforts to get illegal guns registered by offering amnesty to owners. And we'll see where that goes, because there is some discussion of that in the United States as well, as we continue to explore things like gun reforms. So that kind of wraps up part 2. Well, I didn't touch as much on the de-radicalization stuff because I want you to explore that in the article, and we'll certainly explore that on the final exam. But I hope you enjoyed a quick tour of some of the research highlights that I encountered while in the UK, and I very much appreciate everyone that participated in my study and all the cooperation that I received. And I salute their efforts, as I do any person involved in law enforcement and counterterrorism, to protecting the people and for putting their lives on the line. So other than that, I will see you in the next video.